So let's begin reading from Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 5. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry he had made them and put them on the earth. It broke his heart. And the Lord said, I will wipe this human race I have created from the face of the earth. Yes, and I will destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals that scurry along the ground, and even the birds of the sky. I am sorry I ever made them. But Noah found favor with the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, the only blameless person living on the earth at the time, and he walked in close fellowship with God. Noah was the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now God saw that the earth had become corrupt and was filled with violence. God observed all this and all this corruption in the world, for everyone on earth was corrupt. So God said to Noah, I have decided to destroy all living creatures, for they have filled the earth with violence. Yes, I will wipe them all out along with the earth. Verse 22 of chapter 6, and then we'll flow into chapter 7. So Noah did everything exactly as God had commanded him. When everything was ready, and the Lord said to Noah, Go into the boat with all your family, for among all the people of the earth I can see that you alone are righteous. Take with you 7 pairs, male and female, of each animal I have approved for eating and for sacrifice. And take 1 pair of each of the others. Also take 7 pairs of every kind of bird. There must be a male and a female in each pair to ensure that all life will survive on the earth after the flood. 7 days from now I will make the rains pour down on the earth, and it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights, until I have wiped from the earth all the living things I have created. So Noah did everything as the Lord commanded him. Jump down to chapter 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock with him in the boat. He sent a wind to blow across the earth, and the floodwaters began to recede. The underground waters stopped flowing, and the torrential rains from the sky were stopped. So the floodwaters gradually receded from the earth. After 150 days, exactly 5 months from the time of the flood began, the boat came to rest on the mountain of Ararat. 2.5 months later, as the waters continued to go down, other mountain peaks became visible. Jump down to verse 18 of chapter 8. So Noah, his wife, and his sons and their wives left the boat. And all the large and small animals and birds came out of the boat, pair by pair. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there he sacrificed as burnt offerings the animals and birds that had been approved for the purpose. And the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice, and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood. I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. And then into chapter 9. Then God blessed Noah and his sons and told them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. And down to verse 8 of chapter 9. Then God told Noah and his sons, I hereby confirm my covenant with you and your descendants. And with all the animals that were on the boat with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, every living creature on earth, yes, I am confirming my covenant with you. Never again will floodwaters kill all living creatures. Never again will a flood destroy the earth. That God said, I am giving you a sign of my covenant with you and with all living creatures for all generations to come. I have placed my rainbow in the clouds. It is the sign of my covenant with you and with all the earth. When I send clouds over the earth, the rainbow will appear in the clouds, and I will remember my covenant with you and with all living creatures. Never again will the floodwaters destroy all life. When I see the rainbow in the clouds, I will remember the eternal covenant between God and every living creature on earth. Then God said to Noah, Yes, this rainbow is the sign of the covenant I am confirming with all the creatures on earth. What a story. What a story. So I thought about where to start with this, right? Because I mean, it's a heavy story. This is a difficult story to jump into. I mean, it really is. We teach it as a children's story often. We make it nice and cute with all the animals, right? There are the elephants going into the ark and the giraffes and all these birds. But it's really, really a quite terrible story to take in. And so where to start? Well, I thought about this. So I'm a language guy, as most of you know. I like words, I like languages. I've studied several languages in my lifetime, and I eat them up. I love them. One of the things about languages that you have to get right are the rules. Some of you are going, oh, I remember that. Rules. Like if you ever took Spanish, you have to learn the rules of how Spanish works. French, you have to learn the rules of how French works, or whatever language you might have studied. German, it doesn't matter. You have to learn the rules. Well, English has rules too, even though most of them aren't really rules. English is really one of the most ridiculous languages on the earth. It's just so weird because we have one of these rules that's like this. I before E, except after C. And I put that really small up there. You probably can't even read it, and that's on purpose because the English teachers they whisper it, I before E, except after C. And you memorize that, right? Well, really it's I before E, except when your foreign neighbor, Keith, receives 8 counterfeit beige sleighs from feisty caffeinated weightlifters. Weird. It's really not I before E hardly ever. I mean, it's one of these rules that has so many exceptions, even though it's only taught as this one exception, except after C. Except when you really get into it and you have all these exceptions. And there are more. I just found this funny thing online. I thought, man, that's clever. I'm going to use that. Rules. We get that except for. Think about the time of Noah. What was the rule in the land? Do whatever you want, essentially, right? Except for, and here the true except for really means except for Noah. That kind of sets up the story, I think, really well. There's this rule in the land, and that is there are no rules. Do whatever you want, except for Noah, who over and over again it's described, he does what the Lord commands him to do. All right, well, let's dive into this. I want to talk first about the causes of the flood, and this is taking in what I read from chapter 6. The first thing that we have to talk about is that they're described as being filled with violence. The evil being referenced in the story, I think, is probably most closely tied to the violence of Cain and Abel, and then we see, or the violence of Cain, rather, toward Abel, which is depicted in this picture I have up here. But also, that gets fulfilled in a person named Lamech later on. If you've ever read through the first 5 chapters of Genesis, violence is just rampant. It's everywhere, except for Noah, right? Except for Noah. That's because, in essence, creation, this very thing that God has made, is refusing to be God's creation. It's refusing, we as humanity are refusing to do what God wants us to do. And so we're refusing to honor God. And in so doing, humanity has essentially tried to forge a future on its own, right? We can do it without God. We don't need God for this. And that's an unacceptable place to be. And then set between all that violence, all that unceasing human wickedness, is this one person, Noah, about whom it's described that he has found favor or grace in the eyes of the Lord. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. It's interesting that God's eyes are described differently here than in, say, Genesis 1:31. When God sees God's creation at the end of creating, what does God say about the creation? It is very good. That's what God sees in creation, that it's very good. What does God see in Genesis chapter 6? It's filled with violence. That the intentions of the human heart are evil. So these echoes, they take us back to the creation story just a few chapters before. But really what we see is that God is deeply moved about the lives of his creation, about our actions. And that's something we need to keep in mind as we continue on this journey through the Old Testament. Often in the Old Testament, God is depicted as being out there, not caring about what's happening, except to zap people, right, to kill them because I don't like them. That's not the God we see. We see God being moved by our actions. So I want to talk about this idea, though, of Noah finding grace or favor. So we know the flood was provoked by human evil, but the author sets up this really effective contrast between the evil inclination of the human heart and the pained heart or the broken heart of God. Did you notice that? Did you notice that God's heart breaks, that he's pained within his heart? You can almost, I think, feel the difference in the way that the author is writing this. It's not just that God's angry. In fact, anger, we're going to talk about this in a moment, anger is never used. That's not how God is described in this story. God is pained in the heart. The state of the world actually generates 4 reactions in God. And all are really, I think, pretty astonishing when you think about them. The first is that God regrets that he's created humanity. Whew. We just have to take a breath at that. God regrets that he's created humanity. Now, I don't want to get into the potential, well, what does this mean about, if God regrets something, does that mean that, he was really sorry that he did it? I don't want to get into all that. I just want you to, the author of Genesis is just letting that hang with us. That's a tough thing to take in, that God would regret creating us, right? The second thing is that God feels pain in his heart. And I think this leads us to questions potentially like, well, does that mean that when we have a broken heart that maybe that is one way that we connect to being made in the image of God? If we have this kind of emotion, that's part of what connects us to God. And I think one of the things that we would expect is that God would be described here as angry. But of course, as I said, that language is never used of God in the story. God is not described as angry. Okay? Not in Genesis at all. Anywhere in Genesis. And I actually think the way that the author chooses to describe God in the story as being pained in the heart or broken-hearted is actually much deeper and richer than just God got angry. God, no, is deeply... Hey, Lacey, your car is going off again. I don't know if it's yours. I'm just messing with you. It happened to Lacey earlier. That's why I'm messing with him. God is broken-hearted, though. And I think that's even deeper than just God being angry. So what we see in this story isn't some angry tyrant up there waiting to destroy the world, but instead we see a loving parent, a parent who's grieving over the loss of relationship with his children. And I think this is an important point. It shows that God is not some static being up there, unfazed by the comings and goings of humanity. God is decisively impacted by our suffering. God is decisively impacted by our hurt and by our circumstances. God enters into the messiness with us. He doesn't ignore it. He doesn't excuse it. He just enters into it with us. And of course, he enters in no more perfect and beautiful way than in the person of Jesus, right? And as I already said, as I started, that's why we're going through the Old Testament like this. Because Jesus only makes sense when you understand that God has been doing this with us all along. God has been entering into our messiness and hurting with us from the beginning. It's not just when Jesus showed up that God goes, well, I've had enough, now I have to go take care of them. God's been taking care of us from the beginning. And we have to see that. We have to see that truth, the way that Jesus fulfills that ultimate way of doing it. So we see this immensely loving God waiting to rescue us and shower grace upon us at every moment, precisely because God hurts with us. The third reaction we see is that God is going to wipe out humanity. This is the hard one to take in, right? We'll continue to talk about this in a little bit. It's important to note, though, that it's not just humanity that suffered the consequences of our choices. All of creation is bound up with the fate of humanity. Did you notice that in the story? We're tied together intimately with creation. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 8, and I don't want to go there and read it. I'll let you go read that for yourself. But Paul talks about that connection himself, about how we are connected to humanity, and it's because of our sin that creation, rather, is awaiting that time of fulfillment, of promise that God has made. The fourth reaction of God is that Noah has found favor or grace in God's eyes. And of course, the question here is then what is favor? What is grace? What does that mean? What are we talking about? Well, the word in Hebrew is actually the same. Favor and grace are the same word. But it's this positive, it's this accepting, this generous attitude that someone gives us when we don't deserve it. Noah wasn't deserving of God's grace and favor. Noah was just the one that God chose. He walked with God as a righteous and a blameless person. In fact, we're told multiple times throughout the story that Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. All right, well, let's talk about the flood for a moment. And here I'm looking at chapter 7 mostly, those few verses in chapter 7 I read. The first thing I want to talk about is that we have this vessel, if it'll go, there we go. We have this vessel of survivors. And so what we see here is this small little bubble, this small little group of people being saved through the flood. And what's really fascinating about this little bubble of people is that they're not just a small group of people. They carry the hope of humanity into the future with them, right? And the primary focus of the flood narrative, I think, seems to be on this divine punishment as a destruction because we have evil in our heart. But I think there's also this theme present in the story of this cleansing, of this purification of not just humanity, but creation in general. And I would argue that that's how Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3 understands the flood. Turn to 1 Peter 3 with me, if you want to. We looked at this passage a few weeks ago in our Bible class on Sunday morning in connection with baptism, because that's how Peter understands the flood, which is, I think for most of us, a place that we probably wouldn't make the connection, right? But Peter does, and it's very fascinating. So starting in verse 18 of 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter says, Christ suffered for our sins once for all time. He never sinned, but he died for sinners to bring you safely home to God. He suffered physical death, but he was raised to life in the Spirit. So he went and preached to the spirits in prison. Don't ask me what that means. Those who disobeyed God long ago when God waited patiently while Noah was building his boat. Here's the part that I'm interested in. Only 8 people were saved from drowning in that terrible flood. And that water is a picture of baptism, which now saves you, not by removing dirt from your body, but as a response to God from a clean conscience. It is effective because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I would contend that Peter is reading the story not as just divine punishment, but as this purification. And that's what baptism is for us. Christian baptism is the purification, not of the removal of dirt, but of the removal of sin. Well, what was God purifying creation from? The sin of humanity, right? And that's the connection that Peter's making here. So there's something deeper going on than just divine punishment, which is, I think, probably the central theme. But there's something also different going on here, and Peter picks up on it. I also want to talk about the destruction of humanity, okay? So here's the big elephant in the room. What do we do with this? Let me just state up front, I don't have all the answers with how to deal with this story because it is a difficult story to read. It's a difficult topic to explore because of all the destruction, right? That God could do what's described in this story is a little bit frightening, quite frankly, to me, and a little bit troubling. And so we just spent 4 weeks going through 1 John. For those of you who were here with us, we just spent 4 weeks doing that. And in that letter, John states that God is love. And so we have to reconcile. What do we do with the statement, God is love? And yet here we are reading in Genesis 6 through 9, and all of humanity is wiped out, and most of animals and all of that. What do we do with that? How do we reconcile those two ideas? Are they at odds with each other? I think that's a really appropriate question to be asking. I think far too often we've had Christians who have just tried to skirt past it. I mean, there's some who don't want to deal with it, and that's okay. But there are others who do. And sometimes, for those who do, the people who don't want to just easily move quickly beyond it and say, well, God's ways are higher than our ways. That's true, but that doesn't help somebody who's wrestling with the story. Or they might want to say something like, Well, it's not love to allow humanity to persist in their sin. Just like with your own child, you wouldn't allow them to continue to mess up over and over again. Love is bringing them back into correction. I don't disagree with that. But that doesn't necessarily help somebody who's really struggling with reconciling God as love and this story. And so we've got to get past sometimes these get out of jail free cards, right? Like, here you go. Problem solved, right? It's not. I mean, the problem isn't necessarily solved for people who are really struggling with this question. I also need to say briefly about this, because again, I don't have all the answers. I'm not here to give you all the answers. Noah, let me say it this way. I think Christians often, we look back at the Old Testament and we see what we call works righteousness, that the Jews were accepted by God because of their works. That's just wrong. That's not how the Old Testament reads at all. That's a false reading of Paul and what he has to say to the Jews and Romans in particular. It's just a bad way to read the Old Testament. Noah isn't chosen because of works righteousness. Noah's just chosen, and then he follows. So there's this idea that Noah gets, he's proven righteous because of his works, and that's not true. That's just not the way that the story talks about it. God knew Noah was righteous, and so he commanded him to build the ark, not the other way around. Obedience is the fruit of righteousness. Righteousness is not the result of obedience. You're not made right because you're obedient. You're obedient because you're right with God. Okay? And again, I think this really actually dovetails really well with what we looked at in 1 John, where John talks about, because you love God, now you go keep his commandments. Because God loves you and because you love God, now you go keep God's commandments. You don't keep God's commandments and then God goes, okay, now I love you. Now you're my child because you've kept my commandments. No, God says, I love you and you are my child. Now go do what I'm asking you to do. And that's a different way to understand it, but that's the accurate way, I think. All right, I want to talk about the end of the flood here. I'm trying to quickly go through it, I promise you. The climax of the story actually comes in chapter 8, verse 1. So look there with me, if you are open to Genesis. Look back there in chapter 8, verse 1, where we see, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock with him in the boat. God remembered Noah, and he sent a wind to blow across the earth. What does God remembering Noah mean? Does that mean that God forgot about Noah for a while? And was like, nah, oh, that's right. I created this huge flood. Oh, man, oh, gosh, I gotta fix this. I don't think that's what it can mean, right? We have to understand remembered here in a different way. And in fact, the same verb, remembered, is used later on in chapter 9, verse 15, where it says that God will remember his covenant every time he sees the rainbow. All right, so what are we doing here? Does that mean that God is just going to forget God's covenant? Like every time, every day, God wakes up and is like, oh gosh, that's right. I'm in covenant with these people. I can't destroy them today. Well, clearly we can't understand that about covenant, right? Like that can't be what it means. So what does remembering have to mean? I think this is just my take on it, okay? I think remember is probably not the best way to translate this verb here, but maybe that God is mindful of Noah, that God is mindful of his covenants, meaning that always persistently in the front of God's mind are the covenants that God has made with us as his people. That persistently in the front of God's mind was Noah as he was going through this difficult time. I think that's what it has to mean. It can't just mean that God suddenly, oh man, like I'm on the way to the store and then, oh shoot, I had to go do that other thing too. I just remembered that. I don't think it can mean that, okay? But it's an interesting idea to play with. Also in verse 1 of chapter 8, we see this word spirit or wind again. Some of you are probably thinking of the connection back to Genesis 1, where the Spirit of God or the wind of God, it's the same word here in chapter 8 as it was in chapter 1. The Spirit or the wind of God is hovering above the waters. And then the wind there sweeps the waters away and land comes up. I think what we have in Genesis 6 is a recreation account. A new story of creation. What is God doing but starting over with humanity and with all of creation in this moment, right? And so what shows up again but God's wind? Now, whether you translate it spirit, whether you translate it wind, I tend to translate it wind, it doesn't really matter. But especially if you're reading in Hebrew, the word is ruach. There aren't a lot of words, ruach, in Hebrew. I mean, that's a pretty unique word. Those who are reading it in Hebrew, they're meant to immediately be drawn back to that moment in Genesis chapter 1. Oh, God's doing another creation story. There's something new happening here, and it's connected with what God did in the beginning. And then this word gets used in Exodus chapter 14, where in Exodus 14, they're standing before the Reed Sea. The people of Israel are waiting to cross, and what does God send to part the waters? The wind, the Spirit. God comes and parts the waters. Again, there, I think we're asked to remember back to these other two stories of what's happening. And then we see that the Lord was pleased. Well, what was the Lord pleased with? I think it's important to dwell on this point here for a moment, because there aren't a lot of positive notes necessarily to take from this story, because it is so, destructive. So what is going on here? Well, countless times in the Bible we see that God shows his love and his patience toward people in order to save them. And even though God knows our hearts, that they're evil all the time, God is still trying to reach us over and over and over again, right? He is relentless in his pursuit of us. Well, here at the end of chapter 8 is actually the first time that we see that an altar is mentioned, where you would sacrifice something. We've seen humans offering sacrifices before, but this is the first time that an altar actually shows up. Noah does this. And so he presents this thanksgiving offering, and the aroma wafts up to God, and God is pleased whenever he smells the sacrifice. I think this has to be an idiomatic way of just saying that God is pleased with what's happened. Not necessarily pleased that all humanity is gone now, but pleased that Noah and his family are going to begin anew this creative process. We actually see Paul pick up on this a few times, this same kind of language. Your mind may be drawn to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2, or Philippians 4:18, where Paul talks about Jesus, who is, in Ephesians, Jesus has offered himself as a pleasing aroma sacrifice to God. Philippians 4, where there's this generous gift that he's received, and he says that's a pleasing aroma sacrifice. But then also, I think more importantly, in Romans chapter 12, where he says what about us as Christians? That daily we are to offer ourselves as living sacrifices on God's altar, right? I think Paul's picking up on that same kind of language. This pleases the Lord. All right, well, let's close out by talking about the covenant. And here, again, I think we have a recreation account. After the flood, and in spite of our continued sinfulness, God gives us great blessings. He says, be fruitful and multiply. He reissues this command that he gave to Adam and Eve. But more than just this command happens here. He re-gives humanity dominion over creation. I guess apparently we didn't mess it up badly enough the first time. No, I'm kidding, right? But it is striking, I think, that God continues to trust us even though we really, really mess things up, and continue to. God continues to trust us, though. That's important to understand. And one command that he quickly issues here that he didn't back in Genesis 1 and 2 was the command to not murder. He tells us not, and I didn't read this part, but this is a command that he quickly gives, and I think that's because so quickly the first time around, Cain murdered Abel. I mean, it happened so fast, and from that point on, humanity just seemed in a downward spiral. And so he says, don't do that. And he reiterates, because humanity is made in my image. The last thing I want to talk about is the promise of God, because this event ends in covenant. There are 4 major covenants that we're going to see as we go through the Old Testament. I'm going to give them to you quickly. The first is this Noah covenant here, where the promise is actually security for creation. And a beautiful covenant it is, right? It's something, it's great to see this. The Abraham covenant promises the land to the Israelites and promises Abraham a large number of people. That's what we're going to look at next week. The third is the law covenant, where the promise is well-being in the land if they keep the covenant, which of course they don't, so they're kicked out, and ever since then they've had difficulty. The fourth is the David covenant, where the promise is kingship. It, of course, gets fulfilled ultimately in the person of Jesus, right? So you can see how the Old Testament story is feeding right into Jesus popping on the scene. And we're going to highlight the rest of these as we go, but I want to close out by talking about this covenant right now. Noah stepped out of the boat. He stepped out of the boat onto a land devoid of human life. That must have been a daunting thing to realize. Devoid of human life, to start over. But God gave him this reassuring promise, and there are two parts to it that I want to talk about. The first is that never again will a flood cause such destruction on the land. We see that. The last one that I want to look at, though, the second part, is that a rainbow, an emphasis on that word bow, will be the sign of the promise. Now, why am I emphasizing that word bow? Because the word that we translate as rainbow here is actually the same word as bow that you would draw and shoot in war. The idea of a bow is war imagery. It's strength, might imagery. So what is happening here in this story then? I think God is saying, he's just waged war on humanity, right? Essentially, that's the story. He's waged war on humanity. What is he doing with his bow now? Which way does a rainbow point? It points up toward God, right? You think about a rainbow, the curve of a rainbow, it's pointing up toward God, isn't it? I mean, God's out there. I mean, God's not literally up there, but you know what I mean, right? Like, that's the imagery. So what is God doing? I think what we're meant to understand here, God is setting aside his weapon of war and saying, I'm never going to use this on you again. This is the covenant, that I am laying aside this thing that gives me strength, that gives me might, that gives me dominance over you. I'm setting it aside, and that is the imagery of the covenant for you. What a beautiful picture, right? That this weapon of war is being turned into a sign of peace. I think in Isaiah chapter 2, I'm going to read this and then we'll be done here. I think Isaiah picks up on this same kind of idea in Isaiah 2, starting in verse 2. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be the highest of all, the most important place on earth. It will be raised above the hills, and people from all over the world will stream there to worship. People from many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob's God. There he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths." For the Lord's teaching will go out from Zion, his word will go out from Jerusalem. The Lord will mediate between nations and will settle international disputes. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. What is a sword? What is a spear? They're weapons of war. What is Isaiah envisioning? A time when weapons of war are no longer needed. Guys, I don't know about you, but I long for the days when our tanks and our fighter jets and our guns are just collecting rust because they're sitting there needing no use. That's the future for humanity that God, I think, is envisioning in this moment where he is himself setting aside this weapon of war. I long for those days. Those are the days that God wants us to have and to live into. And woe to us because we're not doing it. We're perpetuating this violence. We are still filled with violence. I think God wants us to live in the days where we don't need those weapons of war anymore. And that's the imagery that God's doing. He's setting aside his own. And that's my take on it. You may disagree with that, but I think that's what's happening here. So to conclude, Michael, for you, to conclude, a few takeaways. The first is, can it be said of you that she or he is a righteous person who walks with God? Can that be said of you by your friends, by your family, by a stranger that you just met on the street the other day? Can it be said of you that you are a person a righteous person who walks with the Lord? That's an important question to ask ourselves. The second thing, how are you offering yourself as a living sacrifice to God? Are you sending up a pleasing aroma to the Lord with the way that you live your life? Or is it a stench? Are you a stench in the Lord's nose? Again, a tough question to ask ourselves, right? And then the third thing is, do you rest comfortably in the promises of God? Or do you allow fear, which again connects to 1 John, where perfect love does what? It drives out all fear. Are you living in the promises of God, or are you afraid? Let's not be afraid. Let's live in the promises of God. So I don't know what brought you here this morning. I don't know what you're going through. But I know that we as a church want to help you with it, whatever it is. If you have a need that you want prayed for, you want people to surround you and comfort you, that's what we're here to do. If you want to be baptized this morning, not washing the dirt away, but cleansing yourself of sin, that's what we're here for. We're going to have a song come forward as we stand and sing.